Gators Breakdown is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SCC. And joining me on this episode of Gators Breakdown, just like he has for every opponent preview that we have done so far, is co-host Will Miles. And you can also find his work at readandreaction.com and on Twitter at WillMilesSEC. Well, next comes up one of the weaker opponents besides Kentucky, probably in the SEC East, and that's going to be Vanderbilt.
Yeah, well, Vanderbilt has been giving Florida some tough games the last few years, but obviously has been a traditional doormat in the SEC East, and for various reasons. But a lot of those guys that James Franklin recruited are gone now, and so we'll see whether that bodes well for the Mason regime there at Vandy.
Yep, Derek Mason continues his track, and I'll be interested to know like how much of a hot seat he's on now going into this season. I think it's going to take it would take another stellar finish there for him to get probably hot seat talk, because he's loved by the players, and I know around SEC Media Day talk of him was being one of the best interviews there, and he's a people person, but you got to start winning games eventually there.
Yeah, I don't know how much patience they have at Vanderbilt. Right. Obviously Franklin has probably changed the expectations of what can be done there. But when they had Jay Cutler there before, that changed some of the expectations there as well. And it's not as if they're winning the East on a regular basis. And I to be honest, I'm not sure that Vanderbilt's really interested in eating the money that they would have to make the change at coach. In the past, they've had their coaches picked off because they've been successful. So, and that's one of the other things to consider is who do you bring in next if for some reason Mason struggles. It's either a young up-and-comer who's going to get picked off by the Penn States of the world, or, you let Mason build something there and hopefully have like a Frank Beamer situation like a Virginia Tech where he comes in, he has a few years that are substandard, but then builds the program into something that it hasn't been before. So, I think Mason's dealing with sort of a tough hand at Vanderbilt. They're certainly tough to follow James Franklin, but he's had them ready to play in some of these games for Florida, particularly the ones that have been in Gainesville, and I expect he'll do the same this year.
All right. Remember, you can find Gators Breakdown on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. There you'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes. Hey, look, our past opponent previews are up there all the way up to now. To Vanderbilt, so Mississippi State, LSU, Tennessee, all those opponent previews up there on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. Also, listen to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube if you want the video version. And follow Gators Breakdown on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. Hey, look, while using all those services, please rate and review the show. Let Gator Nation know what they're getting with Gators Breakdown. And, well, as I just mentioned there, Vanderbilt this game's going to be coming off two tough games between LSU and Mississippi State back to back, and then follow that up with Vanderbilt.
Yeah, it's tough every year when you come off of those games where you're getting beat up. I think a lot of it'll probably depend on how Florida is doing at that point, whether they're riding high off of some big wins, whether it's sort of been so-so, or whether it's been a disaster thus far in terms of how things will go. Certainly, I think the season, regardless of how it goes, will hold together better than it did last year. And with that said, I think Florida clearly has the talent advantage in this one.
Yeah, and this is the game where Florida controlled for the most part last season. Then they let Vandy come back, and it took a Malik Davis fourth down touchdown run for 39 yards to put the game away. The Gators had 5 touchdowns between Pirine and Davis last year, and ran for 218 yards. So let's see if Florida can do that again against a Vanderbilt defense, and we'll get to them. That returns most of the starters there. But as far as this season goes, and what Vanderbilt needs to fix for this season, quarterback Kyle Shurmur, who I'm okay on. He's not going to blow you away, but he's I think he is kind of the reason they can put anything together on offense, especially because Ralph Webb's no longer there. And even with him, they still had trouble running the ball last season. So the defense go to that side of the ball now. Wasn't a traditional Derek Mason defense, and just couldn't hold up as the season went on.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the story of Vanderbilt, right? You get a couple of injuries, you don't really have the horses there, and as you get into the teeth of the SEC schedule, that's really where they start to struggle. In the first, it was a tie game coming out of the first half against Florida, and in the second half, Florida was able to take over a little bit. Though I will say the one thing I remember about that game specifically is Florida had a lot of trouble shutting down Shurmur through the air, and that was sort of a harbinger of some of the things that were going to come in the future for Florida. Where the defensive backs really weren't that good last year, at least not statistically that good last year. And Shurmur was able to pick him apart pretty good. And he's not. I mean, he's a good quarterback, I guess. He's not great. So, last year he averaged 7.4 yards per attempt. He lost 2.5 yards per rush. He only had 34 rushes, but still losing yardage. So basically just sacks. Yards above replacement was a stat that I calculate. He's negative 0.47. Much better than Felipe Franks was last year, but much below average. So you get below average quarterback play, Ralph Webb leaving. This is something where I can see the bottom falling out at Vanderbilt on the offensive side of the ball if Shurmur doesn't take a big step forward.
Yeah, he's got seven. Along with him, seven starters are back. But as you just mentioned, 24.6 points a game and only 351 yards a game. So offensive line struggled at times last year. They lose their best playmaker in Ralph Webb, but as I said, they still really couldn't run the ball last year. And also, it kind of just seems like Kyle Shurmur's been there forever. So, I don't know why. This seems like he's been there for a good long while. But as I said, 244 yards per game there for him. It's just as you said, I guess he's just not really anything special. But for them, school record 26 touchdowns. So more than you go back and as you said, Jay Cutler there. So they were able to throw the ball, especially late in the season against Tennessee there. 2,823 yards, 10 picks. So he's got to cut down on those picks. 58% of his throws. So he has enough arm to push it deep at times, and we saw him test the Florida defense as well, as you said. But without his best weapon in Webb and him going to probably be the focal point of the offense now, I mean, can they run the ball enough to help him out? Because I think he's going to need it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look 2 years ago, he completed 42.7% of his passes. 3 years ago. 2 years ago, he completed 54.4 in a full season of work, and last year he completed 57.9. If he improves that up to 60%, maybe it's enough to carry Vanderbilt's offense, but he's going to have to be in that 63-64% range, particularly because he's never averaged more than 7.4 yards per attempt, and the average in the NCAA is 7.3. In his career, he's at 6.7. So again, he doesn't run the ball. He's not a threat with his legs. He doesn't complete a high percentage of his passes, and when he does complete them, they don't go for an extended length down the field. It's hard to score points when your quarterback does that. And Webb, quite honestly, has been able to mask some of that with some of those big plays that they've gotten out of the running game, as opposed to relying on the passing game. They're going to have to get some plays through the passing game this year in order to score points, and we'll see whether Shurmur's up to that task. Historical patterns. Most quarterbacks, when they see 2 or 3% jumps in their completion percentage, don't all of a sudden jump up and they don't jump up to 65%. It doesn't typically happen. I wouldn't expect it to happen here with the lack of a running game and just an extra year of experience.
Yeah, they had trouble grinding last year. As you said, they're going to have to go through the air, especially if they don't improve from last year. 1,286 yards and only 14 scores on the ground. They do have an Illinois transfer, Keyshawn Vaughn, coming in. So there, but go back and look at who he's replacing in Ralph Webb. Top 10 all-time SEC rusher. Vanderbilt carried Vanderbilt offense for 4,178 yards, 32 touchdowns in his career. Just a steady back there who got the ball a lot in his time at Vanderbilt. But Vaughn, go back to him from Illinois, 723 yards, 6 scores in his freshman year at Illinois. Reduced down to 301 yards and only 3 touchdowns last year. So don't know what happened there, why he's transferring to Vanderbilt, especially after a year where his stats went down. But maybe he's kind of a guy who can spark their run game because they were 3-1 last year when they ran for 170 yards or more. And 7-1 over the last 2 years when they hit that mark. So, if they can, and a lot of teams are like this, but it kind of seemed to be a magic point for them. You run the ball for more than 170 yards, you're going to have some success, but they just couldn't do it last year, averaging 3 yards per carry 6 times when that ground game went nowhere. So they're going to have their work cut out for them.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to look on the positive side, on the offensive line, they've got 3 seniors. So their center Bruno Reagan, their right guard Delaripa, and then their left tackle Justin School are all seniors, all 3-star guys too, which is reasonably high ranked for Vanderbilt. And then Sage Young is a junior at left guard, and then they've got a sophomore Devin Cochran at right tackle. But there's some continuity there on the offensive line, and obviously continuity makes a difference, and has made a difference in the past for teams like Vanderbilt. And that's one of the things that Vanderbilt has to rely on is continuity in the offensive line, building a program over a 4-year period. They can't necessarily rely on bringing in 4- and 5-star guys to compete with the 4- and 5-star guys with Alabama and Florida and Georgia and all those guys. So I do think the experience on the offensive line will make a difference. I think we'll probably see there will probably be some plays that a younger offensive line wouldn't be able to deal with, and maybe some things that they can do against less experienced defensive lines and be able to take advantage of that. The problem they're going to have is that Florida's defensive line is not inexperienced. You can argue about its effectiveness, but you can't say that they're inexperienced, because Florida's returning an awful lot of experience as well. So, but that's the one bright spot on the offense that I'd look at for Vanderbilt, is their offensive line is experienced, and that makes a difference.
Yeah, and now if we go to the other side of the ball, what Derek Mason's known for is defense. Didn't do it last year. Kind of started the season where you thought that side of the ball may be kind of what we've known the Vanderbilt defense to be under Derek Mason. But once they had that, go back to last year. Remember, they had that pretty good start over the first 3 games. Allowed 13 points. But they did play Middle Tennessee, Kansas State along the way. They had that game against Alabama, and that was the week before. And that was the week before Florida, I believe. And there was some talk of, oh, yeah, Alabama's coming to town. Vanderbilt's playing good. They're 3-0. They're coming off a win against Kansas State, and I think it was like a 51-0 game or something like that. I think Alabama had got tired of that talk going into that game. So after that game, or starting with that game, it got really ugly. Gave up 34 points or more in 7 of the last 10 games, and of course they lost them all.
Yeah, and they really got run over, starting with that Alabama game. I mean, I don't know exactly what the final score was, but it felt like it was 40-0 in the first quarter.
Yeah.
Against FBS teams, they were 108th in yards per play on the running side of the ball. Gave up 5.3 yards per play. For reference, Florida was sort of middle of the pack, and only gave up. So Florida was 54th, and they gave up 4.2. So a full yard, actually more than a full yard more per play that Vanderbilt was giving up. And obviously that's something that we saw in the Florida game, where Malik Davis in particular was able to run roughshod over the Vanderbilt defense. But it's not as if they were much better against the pass. They were 75th in defensive pass yards per play at 7.5 yards per play. And again, that's just not going to get the job done in any way, shape, or form. And, they had the 91st overall defense in terms of yards per play. It just wasn't good last year. Now, we talked about Tennessee in one of the previews having their 2 leading tacklers being safeties. Well, the same thing happened in Vanderbilt. Apparently in Tennessee, you're not allowed to have anybody but safeties lead your team in tackles. But Ladarius Wiley had 88 tackles, only 1 tackle for loss. That's really indicative that your defensive line is getting beat, and that the safety is being forced to clean it up. And every once in a while, a safety is going to take a bad angle and a big play is going to hit. And, those are the sorts of things that happen. I mean, the game-winning run for Malik Davis, and that's exactly what happened, is they gashed it. The safety couldn't get there and turned into the touchdown that McElwain didn't want.
I forgot about that part of the game that he didn't want. Yeah. And I went back and looked. They lost 59-0 to Alabama. So I was close there.
Worse than you thought.
Yeah. I was trying to give him a little bit of credit, 8 points credit, but no. So only 4 stars returning on this defense that needs a lot of work done, needs a complete overhaul. They lose on the front 3. They lose Johnson Wynn, and I don't know if I had to say this guy's name, so it doesn't matter. He's gone. 8 of the top 13 tacklers are gone. So we mentioned how they struggled last year, but 8 of the top 13 from that team. So maybe addition by subtraction. We'll have to figure out what they can do there with that.
I mean, maybe. The thing is that a a lot of those guys would have played last year if they were any better than the guys who'd been starting, you would
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
And it's not, and like I said, it's not as if these guys bring in recruiting classes that are top 20, and have people that are ready just to plug and play. I mean, Adaingbo had 13 and a half tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, and he's back. Charles Wright, the Jack linebacker, he had 43 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks. So they do have some guys who've caused some havoc in the backfield, but certainly also some guys who got run over quite a bit too. And you wonder whether some of those sack numbers come from gambling and getting out of their gaps, and maybe that's why they were so bad against the run. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Vanderbilt last year wasn't a fantastic defense at all by any stretch of the imagination. They only got sacks on about 3.5% of their total tackles as a ratio. That's relatively low. Florida was even lower, but you look at teams like Alabama, they're typically up in that 4.5 to 5% range of the total tackles that are in the backfield. So, just not an explosive defense. They're not really adding anybody that I would look at and say, oh, this guy absolutely makes them a whole lot better. They've got Josh Smith at middle linebacker, a 4-star guy, who's a senior and a decent player, but still 21 tackles, 4 for loss, 2 sacks. So it's not as if he was like putting up crazy numbers last year either. So, it's Vanderbilt. They're going to struggle. It's one of those things where Mason has been, I think in some capacity has been resting on some of Franklin's players, and that's going to end.
Yeah, so like I said, not a lot of returners coming back, but 3 of the 4 starters that played in their last game against Tennessee to end the season, they're coming back, so they got some there. Do need to be better against the run, as you mentioned. That seemed to be the weakest link, especially in the SEC, where we know as physically as it can get. The trenches, that's where Vanderbilt has to get better. And you mentioned Ladarius Wiley, one of the SEC's better safeties there. Second to team in tackles, 88 stops, had an interception, 5 pass breakups. So maybe with a new attitude and a new defensive coordinator, that's where Vanderbilt can get to get better on that side of the ball. But there's just really not a lot to look at here, especially look when you're struggling. Just as far as stats go, as stopping the run, and can even hardly have trouble stopping the pass. Got to create some turnovers, and that's where they really struggled too. Jason Tarver, that's the new defensive coordinator. He's coming in, going to try and shake some things up, and probably that. But this is kind of where they had good Vanderbilt and bad Vanderbilt. So generated 5 turnovers, all interceptions in the first 3 games. That's when they went 3-0. After that, just 2 interceptions over the last 9 games. Only 4 takeaways overall those last 9 games. So fumble recoveries dead last in the nation with just 2.
Yeah, well, they only forced 8. And so if you're only forcing 8 fumbles, that's a little bit bad fumble luck. You'd think you'd recover 4 of them. But even that, I mean, that's not a whole lot of turnovers. And I think that, again, that goes back to pressure. So if you're getting pressure on the quarterback, if you're getting push up front, then you start to generate turnovers because you make the quarterback backpedal. You make the quarterback make decisions quicker than you want him to. And, that just wasn't something that happened, though obviously they did hurt Del Rio last year and pressured him. But beyond that, I mean, Felipe Franks had a really good second half in that game and wasn't really under any sort of pressure at all. And if you look overall, Vanderbilt, they're starting 22, according to Phil Steele's magazine. If you look at their 24/7 national rating, it's an 85.6. Florida's at 91.3. We already talked about Kentucky. Kentucky's an 87.1. So Kentucky is a step above Vanderbilt, and it's a pretty significant step above Vanderbilt in terms of overall talent. And then if you look at the defensive line, this is really where Florida should take advantage. So the defensive line for Florida is at 91.8. The defensive line for Vanderbilt's 83.2. So there is an enormous talent gap between Florida's defensive line and Vanderbilt's defensive line. And, you can understand why they'd struggle against the run, or why we'd expect them to struggle against the run. They just don't have the horses there in the starting 22, and the guys behind them aren't going to be any higher ranked, or at least aren't going to be much better. And so, there just isn't going to be the depth. You are getting to that point in the season where injuries are starting to play a toll here. You go through that game at Tennessee, at Mississippi State, then LSU, and now you got the Vanderbilt game with Georgia on the other side of the bye. The players could be looking towards that bye, just needing the week off to get healthy. And, hopefully Vanderbilt is just as beat up as Florida is coming into this one. But this is a place where injuries can start to take a toll, but Florida has more talent overall and should be able to weather that.
Yeah, going back and just looking at stats against Florida last year, I mean, this was the game. Felipe Franks, not too bad. As you mentioned, Del Rio went out. He was 7 of 11 for 64 yards at the time. Frank's 10 of 14 for 185 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. But you go back and look at it, probably his best game.
Yeah, it was a little bit of both. I mean, if you go back, so I think it was encouraging at the time because he had been yanked out of the Michigan game, he'd been yanked out of the Kentucky game, and then he comes back in after the Del Rio injury, and you're like, okay, well, what are we going to get here? It was a mixed bag. I mean, he hit a long throw when he first came in, a big post to Tyree Cleveland, and then he missed Cleveland to end the half, and they had to settle for a field goal, even though he had Cleveland open in the end zone. And then the second half was, it was okay. But when you go back and look at it, there were some throws that were into spots where they shouldn't have been. There were throws that were inaccurate. There was another play I remember where he threw a swing pass to a running back and threw it behind him, so he fell, and so they had to settle for a field goal there on one drive as well. So good and bad, which is something we saw with Franks all year last year. He didn't turn over the ball against Vanderbilt, and that was really sort of the big difference. Is when he fumbled the ball or when he threw interceptions, he'd sort of go into a shell. We saw that against Texas A&M in particular, and at that point, then Florida really struggled. So. Yeah, I mean, Frank's played pretty well. But again, who's he playing against?
Yep.
He's playing against the 95th ranked defense or something like that. So you would expect him to play well, even if he's not completely comfortable.
And Malik Davis' stat line for that game: 17 carries, 124 yards, 7.3 yards a carry, 2 touchdowns. We all, like I said, mentioned earlier, when he had put the game away in the fourth quarter there. So. As we mentioned, they really struggled stopping the run, and I think we kind of knew how explosive Malik Davis was coming into this game after a few runs in previous games. But this is the game he really let loose in.
Yeah, this is the one where I think we started to realize it wasn't just a one-hit wonder. It wasn't just Kentucky. It wasn't just that one play against Tennessee. This was something where it's like, okay, when it's 3rd and 2 and he's got to sort of find the 3 yards, he's capable of doing that. And certainly if he can bring that to the field this year coming off of the injury, that'll be a big deal for Florida because, those 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3, those sorts of things where you can convert them into first downs and move the chains are really, really important. And that wasn't something that Florida could do last year after Davis went out with the injury.
All right. Well, that's about it for Vanderbilt. Still a game, looking at it right now, a game I still think Florida should pretty easily win.
Florida has to win this game. No. You can't lose to traditional doormats in the SEC East and expect to have successful seasons. It just doesn't work that way. And there's enough of a challenge in the SEC. You got LSU coming from across the way, Mississippi State as well. If you're dropping games to Vanderbilt, you're in trouble.
Yeah, hopefully not something we have to discuss in Dan Mullen's first year. So remember, you can find Will on Twitter at WillMilesSEC and his work at readandreaction.com. I'm your host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.